The child who spoke for justice. The morning sun spilled through the tall arched windows of Manhattan's Grand Courthouse, its golden light brushing across polished oak benches and marble floors that had borne witness to countless trials, victories, and tragedies over decades. The hushed murmur of the crowd filled Courtroom 7, where the trial of the year had stretched into its sixth relentless month. Michael Thompson, the 28-year-old heir to Thompson Industries, sat slumped at the defendant's table, his tailored suit hanging loose on his frame as if even the fabric had given up hope. His once proud green eyes looked hollow, their brightness dimmed by weeks of public scrutiny, damning headlines, and the crushing weight of betrayal. Once hailed as a visionary young leader destined to carry his father's empire into the future, Michael was now branded by the media as a criminal mastermind accused of orchestrating financial fraud on a massive scale. Every piece of evidence presented so far had seemed to point toward his guilt, each new revelation digging his grave deeper. And now the man who had been his shield, his attorney, was abandoning him in his darkest hour. Richard Davis, the defense lawyer with a reputation for ruthlessness in the courtroom, cleared his throat with a practiced air of finality. "Your Honor," he announced smoothly, though his voice carried the slightest edge of strain, "I must respectfully withdraw from this case due to irreconcilable differences with my client." The words struck Michael like a physical blow, but he said nothing, too weary to protest. Around the room, reporters bent over their notepads, pencils scratching furiously, while photographers shifted for a better angle. They knew this development would dominate tomorrow's headlines. The fallen golden boy of industry, now alone and defenseless. Judge Harrison, a stern figure whose gray hair and sharp eyes had cowed many reckless attorneys into silence, looked down from the bench, his weathered face tightening into disapproval. "Mr. Davis, you are aware of the consequences of abandoning your client at such a critical juncture." His tone was calm, but beneath it lay steel. "I am, Your Honor," Davis replied quickly, bowing his head, though the slightest tremor in his voice betrayed nerves. "But I can no longer in good conscience represent him." His eyes flicked just for a moment toward the gallery, toward a woman who sat 3 rows behind the prosecution with perfect posture and unshakable composure. Victoria Sterling, Michael's fiancée, the woman who was supposed to be his rock through the storm, the one who had wept publicly for him on television while wearing a flawless navy dress that made her seem the picture of loyalty and grief. She sat with her designer handbag clutched firmly in her manicured hands, her expression carefully controlled. But a sharp observer might have noticed the subtle tension in her jaw, the faint tightening of her grip as if she held something far more dangerous than leather and gold-plated zippers. Michael's heart sank as he followed Davis's glance. He didn't understand, not fully, but something in his gut twisted. Victoria had insisted she believed in his innocence, but over the past weeks, he had begun to notice cracks in her facade. Late-night phone calls she dismissed as business, whispers with Richard Davis in corners when they thought no one was watching, and that fleeting, almost imperceptible smile whenever a piece of damning evidence landed in the prosecution's favor. His chest tightened with betrayal, but there was no time to dwell on it. The judge was already calling for order. The prosecutor, Linda Morrison, rose with the confidence of someone who believed victory was inevitable. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than a delay tactic. The defendant has no viable defense left. The evidence is overwhelming, and his own attorney has chosen to abandon him. I recommend we proceed with the verdict immediately." She adjusted her glasses, her expression sharp with triumph. The gallery stirred with anticipation. The smell of ink and cheap coffee thickened the air as journalists prepared to record the final nail in Michael Thompson's coffin. Michael closed his eyes, his mind racing with helpless thoughts. How had it come to this? He had built his reputation on honesty, on carrying forward the legacy of his father, who had always told him that wealth meant nothing if integrity was lost. Yet here he was, branded a thief, abandoned by the very system meant to ensure justice. His hands tightened on the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. He thought of his father, lying frail and weakened in a hospital bed after a devastating stroke, unable to speak in his defense, unable to reassure him. He thought of the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company that now teetered on the edge of ruin. He thought of the betrayal of love and loyalty he had once trusted, and for the first time he wondered if perhaps surrendering would bring him peace. Perhaps it would be easier to accept the punishment even if it was undeserved. than to keep fighting a war he could not win. It was in that moment, when hope seemed to have fled, when the heavy gavel of judgment was ready to fall, that a small, clear voice rose from the back of the courtroom. "I can defend him," the voice declared. It was not loud in volume, but it carried a force that silenced the murmur of the crowd. The words rang with such certainty that even the judge froze, his gavel mid-air. Every head in courtroom 7 turned, eyes sweeping past rows of polished shoes and expensive suits, past notepads and cameras until they landed on the source. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, standing in the back row reserved for spectators. Her faded pink dress hung 2 sizes too big. Her sneakers were worn at the toes, and her curly brown hair was tied back with a stretched-out rubber band. Yet her brown eyes burned with a determination that seemed impossibly vast for her small frame. Judge Harrison slowly removed his glasses, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "Young lady," he said, his voice tempered with both authority and surprise, "this is a courtroom, not a playground. You must not interrupt proceedings." But the girl stepped into the aisle, chin raised, small fists trembling slightly at her sides. "I'm not playing, Your Honor. My name is Emma Johnson, and I can defend him. I know he's innocent." The words caused a ripple of gasps through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching furiously, cameras snapping. The prosecutor gave a sharp, incredulous laugh. "This is absurd. Are we to allow children to participate in high-profile fraud trials now?" But Judge Harrison did not dismiss her. Something in the child's voice, its unshakable certainty, gave him pause. Michael turned, stunned, his tired eyes locking on the little girl. He had seen her before. She had been there almost every day, sitting quietly in the back row with a small notebook in her lap. He had assumed she was just some curious child brought along by a parent. But now he realized she had been watching, listening, absorbing everything. His heart gave a weak flutter of hope. Emma clutched her notebook tightly as she walked forward, her steps small but steady. "I've been here for 3 weeks, Your Honor," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the courtroom. "I've read every document, listened to every witness, and written down everything that didn't make sense. And I can prove Mr. Thompson didn't do this. He's being framed." Her gaze shifted to Victoria Sterling, whose flawless composure cracked for a single fleeting second as her knuckles whitened around her purse. Richard Davis's face, pale and drawn, twitched with unease. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, but Emma didn't falter. She thought of her father, Robert Johnson, who had been a paralegal before cancer took him 2 years ago. He had filled her evenings with stories of justice and fairness, teaching her that the law was not about who had the most money, but about truth. She heard his voice in her memory, soft but firm. "Emma, sometimes the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth." And so, trembling but resolute, she stood in the well of the court, an 8-year-old child ready to challenge the system. Judge Harrison leaned forward, folding his hands on the bench. "Miss Johnson, these are serious accusations. If you have something to present, the court will hear it." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, silencing the protests of the prosecutor. Emma opened her worn notebook, her small hands steady despite the enormity of the moment. "Your Honor," she said, her brown eyes flashing with courage, "this isn't about games or stories. It's about the truth. And the truth is that Mr. Thompson's lawyer was paid to fail him, by someone who stood to gain everything if he went to prison." The gallery erupted with gasps, the tension palpable. For the first time in months, Michael Thompson lifted his head with something in his eyes that had been absent for far too long. Hope. The hidden conspiracy. The air inside courtroom 7 was thick with anticipation, as if every breath held by the crowd might decide the fate of the young man seated at the defendant's table. Emma Johnson, barely taller than the counsel's table itself, stood at the very center of it all. Her faded pink dress a stark contrast against the polished suits and gowns of the courtroom elite. She had no credentials, no law degree, and no authority in the eyes of the law. Yet at that moment she held the power to shift the tide of the trial. Judge Harrison, who had seen hardened criminals, cunning politicians, and silver-tongued lawyers, found himself captivated by this 8-year-old with a notebook full of scribbles. He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled, his expression unreadable but his eyes alive with curiosity. Emma's voice was clear as she turned her small notebook toward the bench. "Your Honor, I know I'm just a kid, but I've been paying attention. maybe more than some of the grown-ups in this room. And I think this whole case is wrong. I think someone wants Mr. Thompson to take the blame for things he never did. She looked down at her notes, the pages filled with tight handwriting and purple ink, and then back up at the judge. I know this because I saw things. I heard things, and they don't match up. The prosecutor, Linda Morrison, tried to interject, her tone sharp and dismissive. This is outrageous. The very idea that the testimony of a child should be considered. But before she could continue, Judge Harrison raised a hand, his tone measured but firm. Counselor, I will decide what is admissible in my court. For now, let the child speak. His gavel struck once, silencing the protests. All eyes turned back to Emma, who took a small but steady breath and continued. She opened to a page filled with diagrams she had drawn, arrows connecting names, dates, and numbers. Your Honor, I started noticing things that didn't make sense 3 weeks ago. Every time Mr. Thompson's lawyer was supposed to object, he didn't. Every time there was a chance to defend him, he stayed quiet. I thought maybe that's how lawyers worked, but then I saw Mr. Davis whispering on his phone during recess, and I followed where he looked. She pointed across the courtroom. He kept looking at Miss Victoria Sterling, Mr. Thompson's fiancée. And then yesterday I heard her. She told him to stick to the plan, and that once Mr. Thompson was convicted, she would inherit everything. She wasn't worried about him being innocent. She was planning to get rid of him. The silence that fell over the courtroom was deafening. A ripple of gasps spread through the gallery, and reporters practically jumped in their seats, pens flying over paper to capture every word. Michael Thompson turned sharply in his chair, his face pale with shock. He stared at Victoria, whose composure was beginning to crack under the weight of so many eyes fixed on her. For the first time, her polished confidence wavered. Her manicured fingers tightened around her purse until her knuckles blanched, and her lips pressed into a thin, hard line. Emma flipped another page in her notebook, her small hand trembling only slightly now as her courage grew. I know people think I'm just a little girl who doesn't understand, but I know how to count and I know how to listen. I saw Mr. Davis's bank records when they showed the evidence. I might not understand all the words, but I saw numbers that matched other numbers. He got 3 payments, $50,000 each. They came from an account connected to Sterling Enterprises. I didn't know what Sterling Enterprises was at first, but then I heard Miss Sterling on her phone, saying that money would make everything worth the risk. Judge Harrison's jaw tightened, his sharp eyes narrowing toward Richard Davis, who was now visibly sweating, his polished confidence shattered. Mr. Davis, the judge said coldly, do you deny these allegations? The lawyer stammered, searching for words, but none came. He shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his collar as though it were strangling him. Victoria Sterling's face turned pale, her lips parting as if to speak, but she stopped herself. For the first time since the trial began, cracks were forming in her carefully constructed mask. Emma pressed on, her determination burning brighter. And that's not all. Yesterday I found this in the trash outside the courthouse. She pulled a crumpled receipt from her pocket, smoothing it against the table. It's Mr. Davis's lunch receipt, but on the back, he wrote down the same account number that money was transferred to. And next to it he wrote the initials VS. I didn't know what that meant until today. She turned her gaze toward Victoria, her young eyes blazing with a mix of innocence and righteous anger. It means Victoria Sterling. The courtroom erupted, voices clashing like thunder. Reporters shouted questions. Spectators whispered fiercely, and the prosecutor slammed her hand on the table in frustration. Judge Harrison pounded his gavel repeatedly, his voice cutting through the chaos. Order, order in the court. When silence finally fell again, he leaned forward, his expression carved from stone. Miss Sterling, this court requires an explanation. Victoria rose to her feet, her face stiff with indignation. This is absurd. You're going to take the word of a child over hard evidence? She's making wild accusations based on trash, literally trash. I will not stand here and have my name slandered by a little girl playing detective. Her voice was icy, but the slight quiver beneath it betrayed her. She glanced toward Richard Davis, her eyes flashing a warning, but the man looked away, guilt written across his features. Michael leaned forward, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and hope. Victoria, he whispered, his voice breaking. Tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't do this. But she didn't answer him. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, her posture rigid, her silence speaking louder than words. Emma, emboldened by the reaction around her, spoke again, her voice steady. "Your Honor, my daddy used to say that telling the truth is scary because powerful people don't like being caught. But truth doesn't change just because someone has money. Mr. Thompson didn't steal anything. Miss Sterling and Mr. Davis tried to make it look like he did so she could take over everything." She held up her notebook once more, her small hands gripping it like a shield. "And I can prove it if you'll let me keep showing what I found." Judge Harrison looked down at her, his expression softening for the briefest moment. This child had no formal training, yet she had uncovered more than seasoned investigators. "Very well," he said firmly, his gavel striking once. "This court will examine the evidence presented. Bailiff, secure Mr. Davis's phone and financial records immediately. And as for Miss Sterling," he paused, his eyes narrowing, "you will remain in this courthouse until further notice." But even as the order left his lips, Victoria's mind was already racing. She was not a woman who built her life on losing. Her carefully woven scheme was unraveling in the hands of a child, and that was something she would not allow. Beneath her calm exterior, she was already calculating her next move, her escape, her vengeance. Michael, meanwhile, looked at Emma with something close to awe. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of faith that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't doomed after all. And in Emma's steady eyes, he saw not just a child, but the very spirit of justice his father had always spoken about. Small, fragile, but unbreakable when fueled by truth. Yet in the shadows of that crowded room, danger was already stirring. The conspiracy Emma had stumbled upon was far deeper and far more dangerous than even she realized. And now that she had spoken, she was no longer an unnoticed child in the back row. She was a threat. The escape and the chase. The heavy silence that had settled over courtroom 7 cracked like glass as the gavel struck once more, echoing across the marble chamber. Judge Harrison had issued his orders with the calm authority of a man who had carried the weight of justice for decades. But beneath the surface, tension pulsed like a storm waiting to break. The bailiff moved quickly toward Richard Davis, demanding his phone and briefcase, while another officer closed in on Victoria Sterling. The once composed fiancée, who had played the part of the loyal partner for months, now sat rigidly in her chair, her flawless makeup doing little to disguise the fear in her eyes. Her fingers tightened around her purse with such ferocity it was as if she were gripping a lifeline. Emma Johnson, her notebook still clutched tightly against her chest, watched with wide eyes, but she wasn't smiling or celebrating. She wasn't even relieved. Something gnawed at her small but sharp instincts, the same instincts her father had nurtured during late nights at the kitchen table, teaching her how to spot the flaws in an argument or the cracks in a plan. Something about the way Richard Davis kept glancing at his phone, even as the bailiff moved to confiscate it, and something about the way Victoria's eyes flicked toward the courtroom door, set her heart pounding with unease. Michael Thompson sat stunned beside his empty defense table, his world spinning. His fiancée, the woman he had trusted, the woman he had planned to marry, stood accused of orchestrating his downfall, and his own lawyer was implicated as her co-conspirator. His chest ached with betrayal, but there was also a flicker of something else he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Hope that the truth was finally breaking through, carried on the voice of an 8-year-old girl in a faded pink dress. The moment fractured when Victoria suddenly stood, her chair screeching across the polished floor. Her voice, once honeyed and sweet, was now sharp and trembling with fury. "This is madness. I refuse to be treated like a criminal because of the ramblings of a child. I will not stay here 1 second longer." She clutched her purse tighter and moved swiftly toward the aisle. The bailiff stepped forward, raising his hand to block her path, but Victoria was already ahead of him. With startling speed, she shoved past, heels clicking furiously against the marble as she darted toward the doors. Gasps erupted from the gallery, reporters leaping to their feet, cameras flashing to capture every second of her desperate flight. "Stop her!" Judge Harrison roared, slamming his gavel, but the sound was drowned in the sudden chaos. The courtroom erupted into shouts as spectators scrambled aside, some too stunned to move, others eager to catch a closer look at the scandal unraveling before them. Emma's heart leapt into her throat as she pointed with her small hand. "She's running!" "She's getting away." Richard Davis, in the midst of surrendering his phone, used the moment of chaos to his advantage. With a desperate glance toward Victoria, He fumbled with his device, thumbs moving frantically across the screen before the bailiff wrenched it from his hands. Emma, standing on her chair now to see above the crowd, caught a glimpse of the message that flashed across his phone just before it disappeared into custody. Package delivered. Proceed to phase 2. Her blood ran cold, nobody else seemed to notice. The crowd's attention was locked on Victoria as she shoved through the heavy double doors, vanishing into the crowded courthouse hallway. Security officers surged after her, radios crackling with urgent calls, but Emma's small voice cut through the chaos again. Your Honor, Mr. Davis just sent a message. He said something about phase 2. But her words were swallowed by the storm of voices, drowned out by the scramble of boots against marble. Only Michael, kneeling slightly to be at her eye level, heard her trembling whisper. What did you see, Emma? He asked urgently, his green eyes burning with fear. Emma clutched her notebook tightly against her chest, her voice trembling but firm. He texted someone. He said the package was delivered and to start phase 2. That means this isn't over. Miss Sterling running away. It's part of something bigger. Michael's chest tightened. He had thought this nightmare might end once the truth came out. But now it seemed the nightmare was only beginning. Phase 2? What does that mean? He asked, but Emma shook her head, her curls bouncing. I don't know yet. But it's bad. I can feel it. The courtroom's energy shifted as Detective Sarah Chen stepped forward from the back row. She had been observing quietly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. Now she revealed her badge, her voice cutting through the din with calm authority. NYPD Financial Crimes Unit. Judge, I suggest we take this child's warning very seriously. I've been following suspicious activity around Thompson Industries for months, and if what she says is true, this conspiracy runs deeper than any of us expected. Judge Harrison, though shaken by the unfolding chaos, nodded gravely. Detective Chen, secure Miss Johnson and Mr. Thompson. Ensure their protection. His gavel came down with finality, but even as order was attempted, the sense of unease lingered. Something unseen, something dangerous was already moving beyond the courtroom walls. Outside, in the crowded hallways of the courthouse, Victoria Sterling moved with purpose through the sea of bodies, her polished appearance slipping as panic crept into her eyes. Yet beneath the panic was calculation. She wasn't merely fleeing, she was executing the next step of a plan crafted long before today. Every movement, every glance at her watch, every message exchanged in secret had been leading to this. She pressed her way through the throngs of onlookers, her manicured fingers tightening on her phone. A driver would be waiting. A safe house had been prepared. Money had already been moved offshore. But more importantly, her accomplices were in motion, carrying out a plan far darker than a courtroom escape. Back inside, Emma's small frame trembled, not from fear of speaking in front of adults, but from a deeper fear, the kind that only comes when you realize the danger has grown bigger than you. She clutched her notebook tighter, remembering her father's words. Justice is not safe, Emma, it's dangerous, because the truth threatens the ones who profit from lies. But courage is doing what's right even when you're scared. Michael crouched beside her, his voice low but steady. Emma, you've already saved me once today. Whatever phase 2 is, we'll figure it out together. I promise. His voice cracked on the last word, but his hand covered hers, steadying her small, trembling fingers. Detective Chen moved toward them, her tone urgent but calm. We need to get both of you to safety. Miss Sterling won't run far, but if she has accomplices, we have to assume you're both targets now. She looked down at Emma with a mix of admiration and concern. You've done more for this case than some officers manage in years, sweetheart. But that means they'll come for you. Emma lifted her chin, her big brown eyes filled with determination far beyond her years. Then we can't hide. We have to stop them before they hurt anyone else. Her voice was small, but it carried a weight that silenced even the detectives around her. In that moment, it was clear. The child who had stepped out of the gallery to defend a man accused of crimes he never committed was no longer just a witness. She was a threat to powerful enemies who would stop at nothing to silence her. And somewhere in the city, beyond the courthouse walls, phase 2 had already begun. The cost of truth. The courthouse that morning had been filled with the murmur of ordinary trial watchers, but by afternoon it was a storm. Reporters shouted questions through the marble corridors. Security scrambled to seal exits, and police radios hissed with urgent calls about Victoria Sterling's sudden disappearance. Yet inside a secured conference chamber adjoining courtroom 7, silence weighed heavier than any noise outside. Michael Thompson sat stiffly in a chair, his face pale, the shock of betrayal still fresh in every muscle of his expression. Across from him, Emma Johnson sat on the edge of her seat, her notebook clutched protectively against her chest. Despite her small stature, she looked unshaken compared to the man who had lived through boardrooms, media storms, and high society, yet was now undone by the deceit of the person he thought he loved most. Detective Sarah Chen paced slowly before them, her sharp eyes flicking between Michael and Emma as if piecing together the final edge of a puzzle. "The message you saw, Emma," she said carefully, "about a package being delivered and Phase 2, we need to assume it wasn't just some bluff. People like Sterling don't make vague threats. They set plans in motion long before they execute them. Which means right now, somewhere in this city, another step of their conspiracy is happening. And it involves more than financial fraud." Emma nodded solemnly. Her small fingers opened her notebook again, flipping to the page where her handwriting scrawled purple ink across cheap lined paper. She said something about money transfers clearing tomorrow. And she mentioned Uncle Frank and hospital paperwork. I wrote it all down. She looked up, her big brown eyes wide with urgency. She was talking about Mr. Thompson's father. She said once he's gone, everything will be hers. Michael's breath caught sharply, the color draining from his face. His father. The man who had built Thompson Industries from the ground up, who had taught him about honor and responsibility, who now lay fragile and silent in a hospital bed after a cruel stroke. His chest constricted with fear. "She's going after my father?" he asked hoarsely, his voice breaking under the weight of the thought. "She's trying to—" He stopped himself, but his eyes burned with terror. "Detective, if this is true, we need protection at the hospital. Now." Chen didn't hesitate. She pulled her radio from her belt, her calm voice snapping into swift commands. "Unit Bravo, I need immediate detail assigned to Presbyterian Hospital. Secure John Thompson's room and cross-check all staff against hospital records. Any new admissions in the last 72 hours, flag them." She lowered the radio, her eyes hard as steel. "If Sterling and her accomplices intend to target your father, they'll make it look like a medical complication. Smooth and visible, the kind of tragedy no one questions. But now we know, and we're going to stop them." Emma listened quietly, her small chest rising and falling rapidly. For all her courage in court, she was still just a child, and the weight of what she had uncovered pressed heavily on her. Yet she didn't flinch. She thought of her own father, gone too soon, and the helplessness she had felt watching him fade. She would not let Michael lose his father to greed and lies. She looked at Michael, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We can't let them hurt him. Not just because he's your dad, but because it's wrong. Nobody should get away with this." Michael leaned forward, his eyes locking with hers. "Emma," he said quietly, "you've already done more than anyone could have asked. You've saved me. You don't have to." But she shook her head firmly, cutting him off with the stubbornness only a child's conviction could hold. "Yes, I do. If I stop now, then the truth gets buried again. My daddy always said that lies grow bigger when nobody stops them. I'm not going to stop." Before Michael could respond, the door burst open and an officer entered, his face flushed. "Detective Chen, we've got a situation. A nurse at Presbyterian just reported suspicious paperwork filed to change the power of attorney for Mr. Thompson. The request came through yesterday afternoon, and the signatory was listed as Victoria Sterling." The room froze. Michael shot to his feet, his fists clenching at his sides. "She forged hospital documents to take control of my father's estate?" His voice cracked, his grief and fury raw. Detective Chen moved quickly, issuing more orders into her radio. "Get me hospital administration. Verify every staff member who had contact with the patient in the last 24 hours. And send a detail to the records department. I want every signature cross-checked." Emma's mind whirled, her pencil already scribbling notes in frantic lines. She thought of Victoria's calm, icy face in the courtroom, the way she had clutched her purse as though it contained more than cosmetics. She thought of Richard Davis's frantic message. "Package delivered." And then it struck her. She looked up suddenly, her small voice trembling but clear. "The package. What if it wasn't just papers? What if it was medicine or poison? Something they slipped into the hospital? Detective Chen stopped pacing, her sharp eyes softening with the realization. She turned to the officer. Get toxicology to check all medications given to John Thompson in the last 72 hours, and pull every nurse and doctor who signed off on his chart. Now. The officer hurried out, leaving the room tense with dread. Michael sank back into his chair, his head in his hands, his voice low and ragged. She wanted me gone. She wanted my father gone. Everything. Everything my family built. He trailed off, overcome. Emma, her small face solemn, reached across the table, her tiny hand resting on his sleeve. You're not gone. And he's not gone yet. We still have time. Detective Chen studied the little girl with quiet awe. In all her years on the force, she had never seen such courage distilled into someone so young. Emma was not simply an accidental witness. She was the thread that was unraveling an entire empire of deceit. But Chen also knew the cost. People like Sterling did not stop when cornered. They lashed out, they destroyed, they silenced. And now, in the eyes of this conspiracy, Emma Johnson was no longer invisible. She was a target. Michael, Chen, said her voice steady, I'm assigning protection to both of you. You don't go anywhere alone. You don't talk to anyone we haven't cleared. Until Sterling is in custody and this phase 2 is neutralized, you're both in danger. Emma nodded gravely, hugging her notebook against her chest as though it were armor. She didn't need to be told twice. She knew. She had felt Victoria's cold gaze on her in the courtroom, the hatred beneath the polished facade. She knew the kind of person she was dealing with, a person who would trade lives for power without blinking. And somewhere in the city, Victoria Sterling was already preparing her next move, her fury burning brighter with every second her carefully laid plan unraveled. She had allies in shadows, money hidden offshore, and the cold ruthlessness of someone who had never lost before. To her, this was no longer about inheritance or control. It was about revenge. The child who had humiliated her in court had made this personal, and Victoria Sterling never forgave. As dusk fell over Manhattan, the lights of the courthouse flickered on, casting long shadows across the city. Inside the secure chamber, Emma sat quietly, her small hands resting on her notebook, her brown eyes fixed on the darkening window. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with unshakable certainty. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The final verdict, the night after the courthouse chaos, was long and sleepless. Michael Thompson sat in a secured suite provided by the police, his heart heavy as he watched over his phone for updates from the hospital. His father's life hung in a balance he could not control, and the weight of betrayal pressed on him like a physical burden. Beside him, curled up in a chair with her notebook clutched protectively in her arms, Emma Johnson finally drifted into an exhausted sleep. For a moment, as Michael watched her chest rise and fall in steady breaths, he marveled at the courage of this child who had stood before a room full of powerful adults and spoken truths no one else dared. In her innocence, she carried more honor than the lawyers, investors, or politicians who had filled his life. When dawn broke, the news came swiftly. At Presbyterian Hospital, a suspicious vial had been discovered among the medications assigned to John Thompson. It was not listed on any official chart and bore the faint markings of an overseas pharmaceutical distributor known for counterfeit drugs. Toxicologists confirmed the contents were lethal, capable of worsening a stroke patient's condition in minutes while appearing like a natural decline. The package, Emma realized with a shudder, had been delivered not to the courthouse, but to the hospital, smuggled through by one of Victoria's accomplices dressed as a nurse. It was intercepted just in time. John Thompson was safe, still weak but alive. The relief that swept through Michael's chest nearly brought him to his knees. He gripped the edge of the table in the suite, his breath shuddering as he absorbed the truth. His father had been targeted, betrayed by the very woman who had claimed to love him, and saved only because a child's sharp eyes had caught what others overlooked. He turned to Emma, who was just waking, her curls messy from sleep and her small body stretching with a yawn. "Emma," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You saved him. You saved us both." She blinked at him sleepily before clutching her notebook tighter, her eyes filled with quiet pride. "I just told the truth," she said simply, echoing her father's old words. But outside the safety of the police suite, the city buzzed with headlines. Victoria Sterling had vanished after slipping past courthouse security, but her face dominated every news broadcast and front page. "Heiress on the run," read one headline. "Courtroom scandal unveiled by child," read another. Across Manhattan, whispers grew louder, and the empire Victoria thought she could control crumbled under the light of exposure. Her bank accounts were frozen, her connections questioned, her name dragged from high society into infamy. Yet for all the noise, she remained hidden, a phantom fueled by rage and humiliation. Detective Sarah Chen coordinated with federal agents, her every step steady and precise. "She won't get far," she promised Michael and Emma. "Her offshore accounts are useless now. Her allies will abandon her once the spotlight burns too bright. People like Sterling only thrive in shadows, and shadows shrink in the face of truth." 2 days later, truth finally cornered her. At a private airstrip on the edge of the city, federal officers apprehended Victoria Sterling as she attempted to board a private jet under a false name. Her purse, always her constant companion, contained not just forged passports but also a ledger of coded transactions, proof of bribes paid, accounts shifted, conspirators bought. The empire of lies had been written in her own hand, tucked away in the very bag she once clutched like a lifeline. When word of her arrest reached the courthouse, a wave of relief swept through those who had followed the trial. But for Michael and Emma, the true victory came only when they returned to courtroom 7, where the case that had seemed unwinnable now stood at its final reckoning. The courtroom was packed once again, every bench filled with reporters, spectators, and curious citizens who had followed the saga. Judge Harrison sat upon the bench, his stern face unreadable, but his eyes burning with focus. Michael sat at the defense table, this time with a new attorney provided by the state, though it was clear to all that the most important defender he had ever known was seated right beside him, a little girl with a notebook in her lap, her small legs swinging above the floor. As proceedings began, the evidence was laid bare. Financial records showing Richard Davis's bribes, phone logs connecting Victoria to offshore accounts, toxicology reports of the intercepted vial. And then came the ledger, the final nail in the coffin of the conspiracy. Every detail Emma had observed, every note she had scribbled aligned with the cold, hard evidence uncovered by investigators. Piece by piece, the web Victoria Sterling had spun collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. When the time came, for closing statements, the prosecutor spoke with dignity, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "this case began as a simple fraud trial, but it has revealed something far greater, a conspiracy driven by greed and betrayal. The true criminal is not the man seated at the defense table, but the woman who sought to destroy him for her own gain. And it was not through the work of seasoned attorneys or investigators that the truth emerged, but through the eyes of a child who refused to accept lies. Justice today belongs not just to Michael Thompson, but to Emma Johnson, whose courage reminds us what this court stands for." The gallery erupted in murmurs, and Judge Harrison raised his gavel, silencing the room. His eyes, however, softened as they fell on Emma. "Miss Johnson," he said, his deep voice carrying across the chamber, "in 30 years on this bench, I have never witnessed anything like what I have seen in this trial. You reminded us that truth is not measured by age, wealth, or power, but by courage. You stood where others faltered. And because of that, justice will prevail." He turned, his gavel striking the bench with sharp finality. "Michael Thompson, you are hereby acquitted of all charges. This court recognizes you as innocent of the crimes alleged against you. Case dismissed." The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder, but it was drowned in the wave of cheers, applause, and gasps that filled the courtroom. Michael bowed his head, tears spilling freely as the weight of months of false accusation lifted from his shoulders. He turned to Emma, who smiled shyly, her cheeks flushed with pride. He knelt beside her, his voice thick with emotion. "Emma, I don't know how to thank you. You gave me back my life. You gave me back my father." She shook her head, her curls bouncing. "I just did what was right," she said softly. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, pens scribbling. "Emma Johnson, the child who saved a millionaire," they wrote. But for Emma, it wasn't about headlines. It was about her father's words, the ones that had guided her all along. Sometimes the smallest voice can speak the loudest truth. She had spoken, and the world had listened. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond Manhattan, beyond New York, even beyond America. It was told as a modern parable, a reminder that justice is not the property of the powerful, but the inheritance of all who dare to speak truth. Michael rebuilt his reputation, not as the heir of an empire, but as a man humbled by betrayal and redeemed by a child's courage. He created a foundation in Emma's name, dedicated to giving children access to education and law, so their voices too could be heard. As for Emma, she returned to her modest home, her notebook filled with purple ink and memories she would never forget. She was still a child, still wore worn sneakers and hand-me-down dresses, but she carried within her the knowledge that she had stood against giants and prevailed. And whenever doubt or fear crept into her young heart, she would remember the day she raised her voice in courtroom 7, when she declared, "I can defend him," and proved that even the smallest among us can change the course of justice. And in that truth lay the story's final verdict, that courage has no age, and that justice, though often hidden in shadows, can always be brought into the light.